I was just about to hit the record button and Pallavi did it. So this is great. Welcome once again to the August DFW OD Network meeting. We have a great presentation for you tonight with our moderator and our panelists. Let me introduce Pallavi Ridout, our moderator. She's an executive coach, a facilitator, a keynote speaker, and an OD consultant. Before the Great Resignation or the Great Reevaluation became a thing, Pallavi underwent her own great career in life reevaluation. 4 years ago, she exited her highly successful career in global talent management and committed to leading a life of no regrets. This led her to launch her own consulting practice called the ELM Advisory. Pallavi joined DFWODnet about 3 years ago, and as part of her commitment to leading a life of no regrets, she actively gives back to organizations such as DFWODnet and ATD. And we have a dog. This is wonderful. Last year, Pallavi led a session on return to work, the new normal, that tug of war between organizations and employees. And as a continuation of that series, we're excited to have her moderate tonight's topic, navigating our world of hybrid work, best practices for organizations, leaders, and employees. Pallavi brings her own flavor leading panel discussions, and you can be assured that today's session will be a highly engaging and interactive session. Ladies and gentlemen, Pallavi Ridout.
Well, thank you, Jim Jameson, for that intro. Folks, we are really excited to bring this program to you tonight. Thank you for all the participants for joining, and of course, thank you to the esteemed panelists. Let's have, shall we? Oh, there we go. Thank you, Jim, for muting our participants. If the rest of you could just go ahead and unmute, that would be great, so we can have no disturbances. But then we will ask you to come off mute on a regular basis, so you're welcome to do that. We have an esteemed panel today who's going to talk to us a little bit about best practices for organizations, leaders, and employees as we navigate the world of hybrid work. We all know, one size does not fit all, but this is about looking at other organizations, looking at the stories that our three esteemed panelists have, and then getting nuggets out of their stories and seeing how can we apply them to ourselves, our clients, our organizations. I know we have a mix of coaches, OD folks who are either entrepreneurs or are embedded in organizations, and some others as well who join our conversations. So I'm really excited to have our panelists with us today. As you can see, Jim was talking about this, this is a female-dominated meeting, generally is, but I'm very excited. This is an all-women panel. That's just my own excitement here. This is a highly engaging discussion, as some of you know who might have attended other things that I've conducted. We encourage the discussion, but as a part of the panel discussion, what we're going to do is have the panelists will get a few questions. They're going to answer them. We'll certainly have activity on the chat. I know you will not disappoint because we usually have the chat blow up. Jim will be monitoring the chat. Pete tends to play the role of a co-facilitator as well. So Pete will look to you for some help there. What we're going to do a little differently today is we're going to have a breakout in the middle of the panel discussion so that you can have some one-on-one time with our panelists. And then we'll have you come back and we'll have a couple more questions with the panelists, and then we'll end with the Q&A session. So you will have ample opportunity to interact with our panelists. So feel free to jot down your questions and maybe hold them off until the very end or until the panel discussion, or sorry, the breakout session as we have it with the panelists. So to kick this off, I want to introduce you to our three esteemed panelists, starting with Anika Hoy. Anika and I first met last year, and last year I was hired by Dolby Laboratories, which, as Anika describes, a small but mighty audiovisual technology company based out of San Francisco. So I was hired along with another consultant to partner with Anika and her team on flex work and helping them come up with a collaborative approach that benefited employees, the teams, as well as organizations. As a leader of the Flex Work program, Anika does a blend of program management and change management. She also looks at workplace and workforce strategy, learning, development, coaching, and facilitation. So a broad range of responsibilities there. So the goal of her team is to empower employees, encourage experimentation, and continuously adapt to the ever-evolving ways of working and connecting with each other. Some fun facts about Anika are, and you know I like to give fun facts about my people. So first of all, she loves numbers. And part of that is because math is the language of storytelling in a data-driven world. And I've seen her in action with that, which is fabulous. But what I personally like about Anika is her energy, her enthusiasm, and the ability to innovate and be creative. She's a true global citizen. She has 2 passports, which is very cool. And she loves horse wrangling and motorcycle riding. So, you know, Anika, as a horse wrangler in Texas, we welcome you with open arms. So thank you for joining us. So at this point, if you can all come off mute and let's just give her a round of applause for joining us and giving us the time. Thank you, Anika. Next, we have Denise. Denise is joining us from Houston, Texas. And Denise and I met very recently. We met through the power of the Lean In Network for Women. And even though we are a recent connection, something just tells me, Denise and I, Denise, this is going to go for a while. You're in my connection and others on this. Denise has had a long career in global organizations addressing talent, leadership, and transformation. She now runs her own organizational development and talent solutions practice. So most recently, Denise has concentrated on the energy sector as president of Lean In Network Energy. It's called LINE, which is dedicated to the empowerment of female leaders in the energy sector. So Denise will be bringing a lot of that conversation today to the table. For this panel discussion, Denise is actually representing not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 energy companies based out of Houston. And she's been kind enough to reach out to the leadership of these organizations to bring us, you know, some of the things they've put into play for the new world of work. She's also EVP of Equity and Leadership, an organization which is to achieve much needed equity for women in work. And if that was not enough, Denise is currently undertaking her PhD by research in gender equity in executive and board leadership. Whew, Denise, you have a lot of energy. I love that. You are out of box thinker, which again, I love about, you know, how you bring to the table that energy. And she's, of course, a smooth talking Australian, as some of you heard, with a little bit of a Texas twang. So if we can give Denise a round of applause, if you can come off mute. Thank you for joining us, Denise. We appreciate it. And last but not the least is Heather Tyree. Heather is also a very new connection through Lean In Network. I had joined the Lean In Network leaders call a few weeks ago, well, probably more than a few weeks ago, and had put a request out to look for people who are very passionate about remote work and hybrid work, especially women. And Vanessa was on the call, and she's on here. So Vanessa, hi. She said, oh my gosh, my CTO, my Chief Talent Officer, will be perfect for this. So let me put you in touch with Heather. And I got on the phone with Heather, and within 10 minutes, I was also like, oh my gosh, Heather, you are the perfect person for this. And I loved, again, you know, the enthusiasm and the energy that Heather came on the call with me to talk about her passion for a hybrid remote work and maybe basically making life easier for the organization and the people. So Heather is joining us from Canada, and she has a diverse background in both large and small organizations in the public as well as private sector. What impressed me about Heather, amongst the many other things, is that she's worked in IT, she's worked in marketing, she's worked in talent, she's worked in culture. So she's got great exposure to a variety of functions in organizations. And she, of course, currently works for Fullscript and is leading the care delivery platform for integrative, Fullscript is the leading care delivery platform for integrative medicine. Sometimes I cannot read, y'all, because I generally do not read. I just go off the cuff. This is very hard for me to read, but I want to do justice to my panelists here. Fullscript has grown from 400 employees to a hybrid team of almost 900 located all over North America. So that is something Heather will be talking to us about, is how did they make that happen in the world of COVID. Heather is a self-professed plant and book nerd. So anybody, if you have those interests, please do look up Heather. And she has 2 lovely daughters and a very lively dog. So please, let's give Heather a round of applause. Thank you for joining us. We are very excited to have you. And perhaps not just today as panelists, and we would love to have you come and join us eventually on our meetings. All right, so let's get started, I am going to start our conversation with a question for all the panelists, and we'll just do a round robin. So the first question, I'll pose it to Anika, is Anika, as COVID hit, what were the challenges that Dolby faced in terms of employees being present at the workplace and the impacts to business? If you can just kind of give us that little story of what was going on as COVID hit Dolby.
Well, I hadn't quite officially joined Dolby when COVID hit, but I will summarize the stories that I've heard. So Dolby's a pretty lab dependent company. We have a lot of very expensive, very technical labs that would be incredibly hard to replicate at people's homes. So we pretty quickly had to figure out who are the people that need access to state-of-the-art labs that we're not building in a garage. And let's get them on a list and sort of rotating through and making sure the critical tests are happening. We realized pretty quickly that was a very small number of people, maybe 50 to 100, depending on where our business cycle was, out of about 800 we had based in San Francisco, 2,400 globally. So we got them up and running. And then I would say IT is the unspoken hero of the entire pandemic, just getting everybody home and connected and working through all the issues we went through. We certainly had our eyes on kind of more remote work, on this sort of work from anywhere concept. So we weren't totally flat-footed, but for a company that's 60 plus years old, we certainly had a lot of change kind of very quickly thrust upon us. And it was a bit of a doozy, but we came out alive. And I think that was sort of the initial spark that created all of this energy around sort of this future of work team that we've been building in response to this. So yeah, it's been a roller coaster, but we're here and we're doing it.
That's fantastic. And I know, right before we actually officially started this call, somebody asked you, what does Dolby do? So if you wouldn't mind just giving us a quick intro to what exactly does this small but mighty company do?
Yes, great call. So Dolby, not Adobe, that's a different company. They do PDFs. We do, the cinema industry was kind of our biggest claim to fame. So if you know Dolby Cinema or Dolby Sound, Dolby Surround Sound, we're really kind of the high level luxury kind of route to experiences. So the Dolby Cinemas usually live in AMCs. They're kind of the premier way to experience, movies like Top Gun and things like that. We've got lots of other little mini projects, VR this and cloud computing that, but I'd probably say the sound in the cinema is where you would recognize our sort of double D logo amongst other places.
Great, thank you. And hence the importance of people having access to the labs.
Yeah,
and
great call.
Business going even as COVID hit. So thank you for that, Anika. I will pose the same question to Heather. So Heather, as COVID hit, what were the organizational challenges at Fullscript that the employees as well as the org was going through? And I believe you just joined around that time.
I had, yes. So I started at Fullscript in May 2020. So right after, just as things were really kind of heating up with COVID. And Fullscript was in a really interesting position, actually, because at that time we had 400 employees, 200 of which worked in warehouses and still do. So Fullscript is part software company. And then we actually also sell supplements to practitioners. So we have to have that distribution network. So all of our office employees started working from home. And that wasn't a huge lift for us, to be honest, because we always had a lot of flexibility. And so most people, we needed to set them up fully with monitors and chairs and all that sort of stuff. But most people were equipped to work at home. Our challenge was making sure that our distribution center employees were safe and well. And it was actually, it was interesting that a lot of the folks who worked in the office felt quite guilty about it, I would say. And it was really a difficult time.
Yeah. And similar to, the question to Anika, can you give us a little bit of an idea of what does Fullscript do? How does it serve its clients?
Yeah, so Fullscript has a software that practitioners use to prescribe supplements to their patients. So when you go to see your doctor and they say, hey, you should take some more vitamin D and calcium, that sort of thing, they can log into the Fullscript platform. And then that order is then fulfilled online and shipped to your home. So pre-pandemic, that was something people were kind of interested in, but not really interested. the pandemic was a huge boon for us, right? So being able to get an online order from your doctor and have it shipped to your home without having to go out to CVS or Walgreens and pick it up was really important to people.
Yeah, certainly. And it caught us all by surprise, right? And especially I think manufacturing industries where, you know, people couldn't work from home. That was a big, heavy lift. So we are very interested in hearing more from you on that as we go through the rest of the questions. Thank you for that. Denise. So Denise, you are representing 4 energy companies today, and you've gone out and had a conversation with the leaders on a variety of things that they experience as a part of COVID. So if you could shed some light on, you know, from the oil and gas industry perspective, what were some of the challenges that the employees and the organizations were facing as COVID hit us?
It varies across the companies, and I think it varies depending on what is the you know, what type of oil and gas that function that they're performing. Obviously, there was for most of those companies that I spoke to, they were very concerned about their in-field operations, and right on the on 2020 in March, you know, it really went into full lockdown as far as all of the head offices all closed down. But some did represent that there was some difficulties that they had with trying to do that in the field. So if they were in the Gulf, or if they were in, say, you know, South Dakota or something. I also spoke to you know, a company that actually is in South Asia, and you know, they had some very specific cultural issues that they were that they would have to deal with, because while they actually just immediately used their business continuity plan, and it was the only company that actually represented to me that their business continuity plan came into being and they used it, which I found actually quite interesting as a professional who's worked in the oil and gas industry. Anytime we've had any major incident, you know, your business continuity plan is how you run the business. So to only have one suggest that that's what they were using, you know, I think it said quite a bit. But in terms of the South Asia company, you know, one of the problems that they had was sending people home, and in a lot of the homes in the country that we're talking about, they had multi-level families, multi-generational families, and so working from home became a really critical issue. A lot of them didn't have home offices, and even for some of those who were in the States, even though they sent them home, a lot of people, you know, depending on where they were in the company, they didn't have a lot of the benefits of home offices, etc. So, sometimes the companies weren't prepared to actually offer them some, you know, laptops and things like that. So there was quite a lot of issues, you know, initially, but it went, you know, really a lot of them were 100% head office at home, and then working out in the field how they were going to manage, you know, rigs and things like that. And some of them closed their rigs, and some of them are still finding it hard to get them back to work now, to open them up. So it's had some really long-lasting effects, even from the immediate problems that they first started with. Does that help give a flavor?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And I see some head shaking, so I'm going to represent that as well. Yeah, it's interesting when you and I were talking about this, what you had mentioned is now they're having difficulty having people come back, not necessarily from a safety perspective, but people don't want to come back to the rigs. They found other jobs, other lucrative things to do. So that's another challenge, right, that has popped up for oil and gas manufacturing also across the board. So So let's go into the next question, which is a very big question. So I know the panelists will take a little bit of time on that. So the question is, so COVID hit, and we just all of us were shocked, right? At all multiple levels, businesses were trying to figure out how to get work done. And slowly but surely, we started getting into what we call the new normal. By the end of 2020, we had embraced the work from home, and people were getting into some kind of a cadence there. And by then, companies had started to figure out, some ways of working together, whether they want to do hybrid, flex, they were not sure. So there was no formula out there, right, on how to do this. There was no playbook, there was no framework. Everybody was kind of making it up as they went along. Most companies were uncomfortable doing that. Some companies mandated things, right? And then there were, state and government laws that came into being. So every company has their own story based on their philosophy, based on their leadership philosophy, outlook, employee engagement, etc., on what they did in order to start making some sense in terms of how they wanted employees to work, where they wanted them to work from. So the question for the panelists is, it's a two-part question. Can you, and I'm going to say briefly here, so can you briefly walk us through making a comparison of what end of 2020 looked like versus end of 2021 look like in terms of hybrid, flex work practices that your organization brought in? Okay, so I'll repeat that question again. So if you can make a comparison of what end of 2020 looked like versus end of 2021 and how your workforce is showing up and operating from a flex work, hybrid, remote work perspective. So how about we kick it off with Heather, and then we can go to Anika and then Denise.
Sure. So at the end of 2020, we were still fully remote. I think like a lot of companies, we kept thinking it'll be 2 more months, it'll be just 3 more months. And then by November of 2020, we just thought, what, let's start planning into 2021. So at the end of 2020, we were still fully remote for the office. But by the end of 2021, what we found is that it started to be different depending on the location. So for example, Arizona was quite a bit ahead of where the Ottawa office was. So in Arizona, the lockdowns were done, the mask mandates were done. And so people started to trickle, and I say trickle, back to the office, because that's when we started to see, okay, although we did surveys early in the pandemic and people said, I definitely want to come back 2 days a week. When it got to actually coming back to the office, most of them said, you know what, I think I was actually just lonely when I answered that survey. I only want to come back in 1 day a week. In Ottawa and our other Canadian locations, end of 2021, still, where most locations were flipping back and forth between lockdown and not lockdown. And we also had our office under construction at that point. So there wasn't necessarily a place to go back to anyway. So we were still pretty much fully remote on the Canadian side.
And what about your manufacturing folks? How did 2020 versus 2021 look for them?
Yeah, so in 2020, at the end of 2020, we were still very fully into, again, we made a decision to go with whatever the local guidelines are rather than do something consistent across the board. Because again, the regulations in Pennsylvania were quite different than what they were in Arizona. So by the end of 2020, we still had distancing, we still had plexiglass up in the break rooms. But in Arizona, the masks were starting to come off. And I would say by the end of 2021, that was the case in Lancaster as well. But we still kept physical distancing and then dividers in the break rooms and hand sanitizers and all that good stuff.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, we also in the early days did temperature checks as people were coming in to the warehouse. And by the end of 2021, we had pulled the temp check machines out.
Got it. There is a definition Pete has put in there about essential workers, right? There were these folks across the board, whether it's in manufacturing, health and care, government, police, etc., who have to show up. And there was, there's dynamics that happen in a company. So you are the headquarter person who can work from home and who's now choosing to come just 1 day a week. And then you are the essential worker who has to show up to work. So I'm curious, what were those dynamics in your organization? How did they show up? And, how did the people deal with it?
Well, especially in our business, we're a health-based company, right? So we really wanted to make sure that we also put some thought into the wellness of the folks who were working in our distribution centers. And luckily for us, we actually have doctors on staff. So part of what the docs would do is they would do once every couple of months information sessions for the folks who were working in the distribution centers. And it was everything from, you know, how do you, in the early days, how do you keep yourself safe? Should you be washing your groceries? Like just talking to people and dealing, actually, to be honest, with the mental stress that they were going through. And then later on, it would the talk switched to vaccines. Should I get vaccinated? Should I not get vaccinated? And we never made it mandatory. It was always a personal choice for us. And it's what's been interesting actually is it's really created a really good awareness within our distribution centers. So they're now asking for the docs to come back in and do physical like exercises that they can do before shifts start. And we have a lot of yoga instructors on staff, so yoga in our distribution centers. So I think it's actually created really good health awareness in general.
That's great. I mean, well-being is such a big topic, right?
Mhm.
So that's become like a side benefit for folks. So great. Thank you
100%.
for sharing. Yeah. All right. So let's hear from Anika. You know, what was the experience for Dolby employees end of 2020 versus 2021 and the organization as well?
Yeah, well, so end of 2020 is kind of when I'd been consulting for Dolby in prior years, but that was when I had first sort of come back to consult for them on this flex work concept. So I was joining. We have about 30 offices all over the world. They were all in different places. China had been locked down and reopened. Sydney at that point was gearing up to reopen. They were looking really good. The US, I think like most of us, especially in San Francisco, was still very much locked down and very much at home. So end of 2020, what we were looking at was actually really China and Sydney as our two offices that were going to be kind of our experiments. Dolby's a big experimental company. We love kind of the blend of art and science. We love tinkering. And so we poised a lot of our sort of flex work principles and philosophies on how do we experiment? So we really kind of lead into supporting those two hubs of ours. And it was interesting to see how differently they kind of came through flex work. So China, you know, I think in the scale of China, Dolby China is very flexible, but I would say in the scale of the world, it's still very quite rigid. And so they're in the office about 4 days a week. Most of them, they get kind of one day they'll work from home. I think that rotates. And then we have sales teams and things that were working more flexibly, even pre-pandemic, as kind of the nature of their jobs. And then we had Sydney on the other end of the spectrum. That was kind of full flex, very fluid. Teams would come and go kind of as they pleased for certain work meetings or for social events. But it was a very different approach to flex. And I think what we realized through that is there isn't going to be one size that fits all. And particularly the nature of work at Dolby is so different. You know, we've got people with, you know, intense lab work, and we have accountants that could work from the moon as long as they have Wi-Fi. And so we have just such diversity of roles that, you know, we couldn't create a policy that was going to make sense to everyone. And so with that learning through those sort of experiments or pilots, as we called them, we realized the importance of really deconstructing our work and really understanding what are the moments that we need to be prioritizing to do in person, and what are the things that are best done at home. And then how do we empower our people to actually build their schedules around that? So we first introduced sort of our actual philosophy and principles around flex. The principles being sort of, we trust you. That's why we hired you. We trust you to make good decisions about how you work. We really think there's importance to intentional connection, and that while running into someone in a hallway is great. Oh, my headphones might die. If I go quiet, somebody let me know. So, you know, running into someone in a hallway is great, but it's not intentional. And so we shouldn't be really relying on chance for a lot of these things, though serendipity is fantastic too. Flexibility was a big principle too, that we need to be flexible about this. What works today might not work in 6 months, and we have to acknowledge that things will continue to change. And then all of this sort of in pursuit of belonging, that again, one size doesn't fit all, everybody's work's going to be different. And all of that lastly in pursuit of one Dolby. So balancing kind of what are your personal needs with the needs of the business, and being able to have honest conversations about that. So we introduced those. We also introduced a tool we built in-house. We called it the Flex Kit. I try to put a flex pun in as pretty much anywhere I can. We also had Flexperts and Flexperiences. But the Flex Kit was a tool we built, which was kind of a beautiful spreadsheet, I would say, that really helped people document what are the activities you do, what are the types of meetings you have, one-on-one, status updates, brainstorming, writing emails, technical work that is beyond what I could explain. And then what percentage of time do you typically spend doing, we know it's going to be wrong, but give it a good guess. And who are the people you rely on to make those decisions? And so we did this exercise not with the intention of having perfect data, but with the intention of getting people thinking about what are these activities and how do we prioritize them. So that was the exercise that ran us kind of through most of 2021 to when we thought we would be opening the offices, I think, or most of our US offices in September. We realized that wasn't going to happen. Then we hit December in 2021. That wasn't going to happen. So we didn't really kind of officially reopen our offices until May of this year. So it was a lot of moving and changing expectations the whole time. But I do think we set expectations in the beginning that this is going to be messy and we're going to have to change things. So we're all in this together, and the more we can kind of work together around it and not blame people or blame elements outside of our control, the better we'll kind of become for it. That has been our wild ride to this point.
Yeah, you have been very flexible about the whole process. I like that.
I
So
try.
I had the privilege of taking a look at that sheet and the data. Jim, I know you put the question there or the comment in the chat. And we were, so when we came into Dolby to do the work, we thought we might have to go out and collect data, but there was so much data available. Anika and her team had done such a fabulous job, as well as the employees, in actually truly providing meaningful data. And, in a lot of research that we've come across around flex work or hybrid remote work, the biggest thing that thought leaders and folks who've done a little bit of work on here have said is that iterative approach is very helpful. And that's what we've been hearing from our panelists is, let's figure this out as we go along, and hey, people, employees, let's come along together. If it doesn't work, then let's try something else. So that's definitely, we appreciated that when we saw that at Dolby. So congratulations on finally getting folks into the offices as of May. I know you've been trying for a while. So thank you for sharing that, Anika. We will go to Denise next. And Denise, I know you have 4 companies, so maybe, however you can distill that to what did 2020 look like for maybe 1 or 2 companies versus then 2021?
Well, I think from the information that I was provided with, and also from my own knowledge of living and being in Houston when all of this was going on, surrounded by so many people in oil and gas, I think some of the journeys were very similar. So, for example, I think initially a lot of people were, even though most of the companies, their offices were all were all shut down. Everyone was working from home, and by 2021, by the end of 2020, they had really worked out in the main of what that hybrid looked like. So initially it was 100% work from home. Then it started to morph into a 2-day, 3-day type scenario for a couple of the companies, where they'd work in the office for 2 days and 3 days might be at home. There was some discrepancy between the organizations in terms of how did they deploy the making sure that people were vaccinated. Some were very there was a lot of monitoring going on, tracing going on, all that kind of thing was taking place in the majority of companies. But they did certainly, it was interesting, one of the companies did mention that because of the nature of the shutdown and the nature of their work, one company had a 30% layoff in May of 2020. And that certainly impacted their business, moving forward. So I think even in operations, one of the companies mentioned that by the time they got to the end of 2020, they were really working on extended work schedules. which included, it could have been 14 days on, 14 days off, or 21 days on, 21 days off, or even month to month, because what they were trying to do was to minimize changeovers. What I would say, and this is not a negative towards the oil and gas industry, but when you hear what Dolby, for example, was doing and the way that they use professionals, no one commented to me that they were doing a lot of the type of work that was being done in Dolby laboratories. So I think a lot of it was fly by the seat of the pants, and which is probably historical for oil and gas to operate that way. And I think that when you have a look at a lot of them are still operating on that 2 to 3 day, even now, that 2 days in, 3 days off, for their offices. Some of them took longer than others to actually open up in their either their offices in the field. One of them actually didn't open up till April of 2022. So there's a lot of different different reasons that this is occurring in different companies. But 2 companies were talking about the new normal being implemented, and they, the use of that word started to come up quite regularly, and the concept of flex schedules, etc. So what is interesting though, but by the end of 2021, one of the companies actually indicated that work schedules in the Gulf of Mexico and in Asia were actually being reversed to normal, to what they had been previously. So it's interesting to see the traction that in some companies the work schedules may have had, and in others that it didn't have for those production type facilities.
Yeah, what's emerging is the luxury certain organizations can have depending on the nature of the work versus not, where mandates have to be put in for the work to be performed. And it sounds like perhaps in oil and gas it's a little bit more of that mandate that comes down versus a more collaborative effort to have employees participate in decision making on, hey, how many days do I want to work from home versus not. Did you find that there was a lot of the top-down mandates happening in oil and gas versus, let's say, recently Anika spoke about more of that, let's bring the employees in and get their opinions going type of approach?
I know a couple of them did indicate that they spent a lot of time communicating with their staff. I'm not necessarily sure whether that was a communication which was to from a survey perspective, but I think there was a lot of the top-down approach. In fact, one of the very senior people that I spoke to in one of the companies actually said that in hindsight she felt that they should have taken a much stronger top-down approach, and the general comment seemed to be that the work population actually understood the this flex approach, working from home, better than the leaders did. And I thought that was a very interesting comment. And we have to remember that oil and gas perhaps hasn't been as sophisticated in thinking through its innovation relating to its people in the same way that it talks about its innovation with its technology. And I find that a very interesting dilemma for oil and gas.
Yes, interesting indeed. Thank you for sharing that. I think Anika has shared a file in the chat, which I'm sure a lot of people are very excited to see. So let me go to Anika next. What we're going to do next is each panelist would get one unique question based on your unique experience in your organization, and we would love to get a little bit more information from you on that. So for Anika, you also have responsibility for workplace design, workspace design, which I think is so cool. I mean, you love the creative aspect of things. So so if you can comment on what role do you feel workplace design play in promoting flex and hybrid work, in the sense of, people are saying, I did all the work at home. Why should I even bother to come into the workplace? And if I do, what is the reason I'm coming into? And if I'm coming into it, how are you motivating me to be there? So how does workspace design play a role in all this conversation we're having with employees?
It's a funny place to be. I think right now we've got the real estate industry saying, everybody needs to get back to the office. It's the only way we can work. And you can kind of see the bias sometimes in some of the articles that come out from the bigger real estate companies. But I do think there is value to it. There's value to having a place in the same way that we have cultural centers and museums. And there's so much that you can communicate through being in a physical space together, despite the fact you can also do so much not being in a physical space together. So for me, as we think about how we work, right, it's what are these moments that make magic at our company? And then how do we design space to support that? So for one example, our engineering teams, they'll do these things, they call them focus days. And they'll, 6 to 10 of them will all reserve a giant room. Ideally, there's workstations in the room. And they'll spend 6 hours working on something totally together, clear all other meetings, just focusing on that task at hand. And for them, that's like their flow state. They can ask quick questions. They can say, hey, can you come and sit and look at this with me? And they can knock out so much more work kind of that way than oftentimes you can when you're in a virtual setting. That being said, there's also teams that do the same thing totally virtual because chat works just fine and they've got their video conferencing on and they can screen share. So there are different ways to kind of creating these moments together. But I think for us, we think about flex. And if I think about our, headquarters in San Francisco right now, we've got 16 floors. It can hold about 1,000 people. And we see at most 300 on a peak day. Now, I would say on average, we see about 180 people. So 180 people compared to 1,000 capacity, there's obviously a huge amount of real estate savings that will be hopefully gained in the next few years as we continue to flex. So for us, flex in itself ultimately was a talent choice. It was because we're competing for tech talent, which is some of the most competitive in the world. And in listening to that talent, they don't want to be in the office 5 days a week. So that was kind of our forcing mechanism. But in response to that, there's also a lot of strategy kind of at play when it comes to location and hiring and sort of now where our talent markets and how far can we hire out from our hubs. So I think the real estate creates these sort of meccas for people to rally around. And I see it as my job to help them kind of find those moments and then deliver the space that supports it, which I think we've learned is not necessarily heads down focus work that happens at cubicles, but it's more of the sort of communal time together, the messy meetings that aren't just status updates. So I'm really excited about how the workplace will sort of catch up to this. I think you'll see a lot more of we were even talking about, does Dolby just sponsor a nightclub? And that's where we put one of our labs. And we say, actually the recording labs in this crazy nightclub, we don't even need to have an office in, LA or whatever it might be. So I'm really excited about how we've really transformed, how we work together. And now let's transform the physical space around it.
That's cool. We will be happy to bring one of our OD meetings to that nightclub when it happens. Now, you had also mentioned you had provided different teams with opportunities to design kind of an interesting workspace for themselves. How was that experience?
It's fun. It's funny. So we kind of got excited about like the cooking show approach of like, oh, we're going to give people a budget and a designer and they can go design their space and it's going to be great. And so we had an engineering team that wanted to really like lean into a Scrum space. We had another kind of cloud team that wanted to build a project room. And though there was a lot of enthusiasm, it's kind of like, maybe not in America, but in most places, it's like you don't walk into the doctor and say, hey, I want this prescription. You say, hey, these are my symptoms. And then your doctor, the expert, says, hey, here's the prescription you should have. And I think we kind of learned that one the hard way of like, though we have some really smart and gung-ho people at our company, they are not experts in how to design space. And so we have a couple of spaces with like 2 speakerphones right next to each other. And you're like, why is this the thing? And I'm like, you guys are brilliant. You're sound engineers. How did nobody think of this? So we learned a lot through that process that sometimes it's good to bring in the experts and say, hey, CBRE, hey, Colliers, hey, people who do this all the time, what are your recommendations here? That being said, it was an excellent sort of mechanism of change management, that you get people bought in from the very beginning. You say, yes, we're taking your desk away, which can be a very sensitive subject for a lot of people. But you say, we're designing this really cool space, help us design it. And so that process itself was great, but maybe a few more guardrails along the way would be good.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, it is a hot topic right now on, obviously companies trying to figure out what do we do with this real estate. We don't want to give it all up, but how do we make this a more meaningful experience when people come in? And I think we've talked about this when we did the work with Dolby, is the connection, collaboration, innovation is what needs to happen when people come into a workspace physically. It's not the regular mundane work. But in order to do that, how do you create that vibe, that environment, the motivation to show up? So I think that's something that's on the rise here. So thank you for sharing that, Anika.
Can I just, I just think there's something really interesting in what Anika mentioned about having so many floors and only having 180 people on a regular basis. In Houston, we have literally hundreds of empty, huge buildings. And one of the comments that was made and this just shows you the difference of thinking and how some of the thinking around creative thinking has been stifled, is that it was actually described that there's been a decision-making has suffered because of the handcuffing to overhead contracts that they currently have in terms of rental and things like that. And so the decisions that they're making to get people to come back is just so that they can use the space because they're paying for it, as opposed to thinking in a different way until those contracts are finished. So I think there's a difference in the thinking, which I think is really relevant to any of these discussions.
Yeah, great point there. How, again, different organizations view things so differently, right? In your case, in the energy sector, as you're talking about, it's basically not your Denise, but yeah, it's about, it's a waste of money. So let that drive the decision. Thank you for sharing that. Really great point. Heather, so we're curious, Fullscript grew from 400 to 900 people during COVID. And when we were talking, it was fascinating how you talked about the strategy that you helped bring into the organization from a labor perspective. And how do we, source our talent? How do we look at it very differently than we did in the past? So could you help us understand, the kind of the evolution that Fullscript went through under your guidance on how you approach hiring your talent and where they're located and everything else that goes along with it?
Sure. So first, I should confess, part of that growth was acquisition. So 350 of those people was a company we acquired, but the rest of them we did hire. And as the tides were starting to turn with COVID, right, and everybody was thinking about coming back to the office, we actually spent a little bit of time not making a decision and just observing what was going on in the market. And what we noticed was the companies who were choosing either extreme were not faring very well. So those who said, you have to come back to the office, there was all sorts of backlash against that. And the companies that said, hey, we're just going to go fully remote and there's going to be no space for you, there was also backlash against that, right? And when we polled our own employees, it was kind of the classic bell curve, right? 10% said, I'm happy to never come back in. 80% said, I want to come in two or 3 days a week. And 10% said, 5 days a week, I miss everybody. I want to come back in. So we took all that information and we said, you know what, this is an opportunity. Before that, we'd been constrained to either Phoenix or Ottawa when we were hiring. And that was actually inhibiting our growth because those are both limited labor markets. But knowing that people wanted to get together, rather than just randomly hiring people all over North America, we said, let's take a look at what locations we think will be good hubs for us. Because we believe that people are going to want to come and gather. They're not going to want to come back 5 days a week, but they're going to want to hang out with other people eventually when they can leave their homes. So we identified like 10 different locations across the US that we thought would be potential labor markets for us. particularly where they were engineers or salespeople. Those were the two biggies. And we started targeting those locations. So we hired our first few people in Atlanta, for example. In Canada, we hired a hub, we created a hub in British Columbia in a city called Kelowna, which is outside Vancouver and a little bit more affordable. And we opened up a customer success group in Kelowna. And our longer term philosophy is, and then when we acquired Emerson Ecologics, they have 3 distribution centers and then an office in Manchester, New Hampshire. So our philosophy going forward is, once a hub location gets above probably about 10 people, 10, 15 people, then we'll start looking at WeWorkspace or Regis, or, you know, one of those places so that people can gather together. And a big part of our philosophy behind that came from our guiding principles, actually, and out of our values. So 2 of our main values are that people, given the right opportunity, will make good choices, right? Be an independent thinkers, and outcomes matter. So outcomes for us matter way more than FaceTime or being in the office. So based on that, we're 100% comfortable with people continuing to work hybrid. And in fact, we call the program Work Wherever You Work Well. And when we hire new employees, we give them a stipend to set up a home office. And we tell them, we're not going to tell you how many days to come in the office. You tell us where you work the best. And if you want to come in 5 days a week, great, we will make space for you. And if you only want to come in 1 day a week, excellent. We just need to know so that we can plan the space accordingly.
Wow, what a great story. I mean, you know, opening up all those labor markets, we've been reading about some companies doing that, but great to talk to you in person to find out that it's a strategy you thought about and then you put it into play and it's successful. And I love how you said, you know, really trusting your people in saying, we trust you to make good choices and work from wherever you want to. I think we heard Dolby, you know, Anika say that about trust as well. And it does go a long way in helping employees feel that sense of pride or belonging, or, you know, that I am trusted to do what is good, what is right. And I think, you know, I love to hear a little bit from Denise later, maybe in your breakout room, Denise, if it comes up. How does this show up in the oil and gas? We don't have time right now to go there, but it just popped up, you know. So let's go to Denise with the last question on the unique questions for the panelists. Denise, you do a lot of work with women on empowering women and leadership as a part of your equity work, as a part of Lean-In. You're a Lean-In regional leader. So I'm curious, you know, I think it was at the beginning of 2021 in February, where we had the number was 3 million women had permanently exited the US workforce. And the number is even more staggering across the globe. And by having that exodus, organizations are losing so much in terms of what women bring into the work, right? So, you know, it is known that women, because of the way they are design our makeup, etc., there's more collaboration that happens. There is more inclusive dialogue that happens. DE&I gets more supported because of that. So I'm curious, what do you think are the impacts of DE&I, especially when it comes to women, the inclusion part, when you bring in certain type of hybrid practices or not into the workplace? How does that impact women? How is it impacting the future of women in the workforce?
Well, in fact, two of the companies spoke directly to the issue of women in implementing hybrid types of work scenarios. And one company in particular said that they're not expecting to get women back into the workforce, their workforce. For at least 5 years, they're not going to see a change, because there's a lot of women who've taken the decision that occurred through the pandemic and into the post-pandemic period, where women have said, look, you know, I'm concerned about the schooling for my children. I'm concerned about the home care situation. I can't do both, because everything was tending to fall onto the female. And so there really are some very real constraints around the success of DEI when you have so many women who anyway, when you have a look at the whole history in oil and gas, for example, we know that STEM hasn't worked to the way that people have hoped that it would. That's not to say that we don't have the right numbers coming through. In very many parts of the world, we have the right numbers coming through in STEM, but what's not taking place from a STEM perspective is that they're not getting the opportunities to rise beyond middle management. And so they're not only leaving their jobs, but their companies, they're actually leaving the sector itself. And two of the companies actually indicated that through the experience of the pandemic period, they've actually had a much higher turnover of women. I mean, I'm not speaking anything that most people haven't understood. But so we've got that issue, and the issue that really is impactful that was commented on, and I've had it commented on to me personally by a very senior person in a business, has been that they are really concerned about two things. How do they create culture with so many people? Because to be honest with you, a lot of oil and gas companies haven't done a good job of culture in the first place when they had everyone at work, let alone now that they've got people working, away from the office. And the second thing is that as far as women are concerned, how and any of their people really is how are they going to make decisions around succession planning, around retention, around high potentials, etc. Because they're really stumped by this concept of not seeing people in the office every day. So we're dealing with a very different mentality, and women have really suffered with that mentality. They had suffered prior to the pandemic, and they're suffering post the pandemic. So it really has impacted women severely.
Yeah. Are there maybe one or two things that, you would advise companies to put into place or be more mindful of when it comes to creating conditions to retain women in the workplace?
Well, it's, the things that I've mentioned to people is, it's one thing to create a work schedule, but then you've got to, when you start using these words about new normal, flex working, etc., you've got to understand that the organization, it's not just about saying you're working from home. It's about recognizing that how do we accommodate that for when we recognize that women are being impacted so severely. So you really have to think through not just the schedule, the work schedule. You have to think about what impact is that having on women, or whoever is the major carer. But let's just say in this perspective, it's women. So really, you have to balance that decision making, not just sticking to the schedule, but really looking at what can we do to assist. What do we have to change about how we operate to make a difference? I mean, and that's a question for a lot of companies, not just oil and gas, but I think it's very prevalent in the oil and gas because they have been used to laying off women and men on a regular basis, but now the dynamic has actually changed as well. So I think it's a much more complex response than many of them actually realise. And I know that they're really worried about it because even in private conversations, they've commented to me separately on some of those issues for women.
Yeah, thank you for that. And when we talk about DE&I, we talk about other groups of people as well, right? And we chose to focus on women here, but it applies to different groups, and we are finding more and more that companies need to look at, again, not one size fit all type strategies. Is let's look at the groups, let's look at their needs, and go beyond the whatever 9 to 5, you're going to work from here, there, what are your needs? So thank you for shedding the light on that. What we're going to do next is, thank you participants, you have been so kind in your silence, and I know there's been a bunch of chat going on in the chatter, but this is the time to get some engagement going. So what we're going to do is we're going to do 3 breakout rooms, and Jim is going to be putting you randomly into one of the 3 breakout rooms. Each one of our panelists will be the main leader in that group. So this is your chance. You get about 10 minutes. You're more than welcome to ask questions, make comments. And if you wish to join a different group, you can. Jim will walk us through the instructions shortly. But we do want to give you that leeway as well, in case you have a burning question for one panelist, but you found yourself in another room. So that'll be 10 minutes. And then when we come back, what I'll request the panelists is, when we come back, if you can just quickly summarize, what were the big things, the themes that came out of that 10-minute conversation. And then if we have time, we'll go into one more question. If not, we'll go into a bigger Q&A. So, so Jim, if you could just walk us through, if somebody wants to switch rooms, what they need to do.
Yes, thank you. What we're going to do is we're going to randomly assign you to one of the 3 rooms first, but then if there's a particular room you want to be in, you can move yourself by clicking the thing at the bottom that says breakout rooms, assuming that you're on a laptop or PC. If you're on a tablet, I'm not real sure how you do this, but you can probably find the breakout rooms menu somewhere on there. But on a PC, just click that room at the bottom and choose the room you want to go to. And the way you would do that is, in room 1, it's going to be Denise will be the main leader in room 1. In room 2, it will be Heather. And in room 3, it will be Anika. And I'm going to have to do a little bit of initial rebalancing, because when I created these rooms, we had several people who are no longer here. So I'm probably going to be switching a few people around almost immediately after you go into the room. So basically, you get into the room, you might listen a few minutes to see if this is the room you want. Stay in the room if you want. Go back to the main room if you want, or switch to another room. You can wander around at will. So I see we've already lost a few more people. So maybe this is a good time for people to walk out the door in some cases, or maybe some people don't want the breakout rooms, or maybe it's time to go. But I'm going to go ahead and open the rooms. You'll have 10 minutes in the room, and you'll get a 2-minute warning. So you actually have a total of 12 minutes. So 10 minutes in the room, then you'll get a 2-minute warning. That'll give you time to wrap up the conversations, and we'll all come back automatically to the main room. So I'm going to open the rooms now, and then I may shuffle a few people if the rooms don't end up even after the people have exited. So we'll see you back here in a little while. Any questions before I go? Okay, off we go. I assume everyone, very good. I assume everyone had a good breakout discussion. I'll turn it back over to Pallavi, and she can quiz you.
Excellent. So this is the part where we don't feel FOMO. Everybody, I'm sure, is familiar with FOMO, fear of missing out. So for those of us who were not in all the breakout rooms at the same time, listening to all the discussions, we want to know from the panelists, leaders, if you could just summarize for us what happened in your room. What were some big things that emerged? If you could just briefly, take us and give us a tour of that. So why don't we start with Heather?
Sure. So we talked, we went more in depth on the divide between office and distribution center employees. So essential, right? Those who have to continue to go into work, and those who have a perk, really, of being able, a privilege of being able to work hybrid, and what a challenge it is to create equity between those two groups. And then we also talked a bit about companies that are requiring people to either be fully remote or outside, and how you manage that. And we were actually just getting into, David was telling us a really good story, because we had a great conversation about, even when you go back to the, people start going back to the office, how important it is to still have one person, one screen, right? So because when you have people in a meeting room, and then 5 people who are not in that meeting room, it creates not a great dynamic. So it tends to work better if even the people in the meeting room open up their laptops and log in.
Ah, yes, those interesting visual challenges. Certainly. Well, sounds like a great discussion. Thank you. Denise, how were the discussions in your room? Were they similar to Heather's room or very different?
No, I think, well, I think we we were focused on was essentially whether it was about people coming back into the workforce, particularly from a woman's perspective. Was is it about trust, or is it about the fact that the decisions that were being made were just around exigency? And I think the question was also raised is that there's not a vision there. There's not a proactive thinking. It's just we're going to end up perhaps going back to or the hope that we go back to the way that it was prior to the pandemic. And I do get a strong sense that a lot of companies, a lot of the people at the top end are still thinking that, and they're really getting this horribly wrong, and they're losing good talent because of it.
Yeah, it's just not going to go back to what it was. Let's just make peace with that.
Well, the interesting thing is, and I often use this, is that Charles Handy, a futurist back in the 90s, one of the things that he said is that we walk into the future looking behind us, because what's behind us gives us comfort, makes us feel comfortable. And so I think when you have a look at who run a lot of the companies that I'm relating to, that they are often can be older people. I'm talking, big majors or people who've been in oil and gas all their lives. So that is the comfort that they're looking for, and so we really have to break that kind of thinking.
Yeah. Yes. So thank you, Denise. Anika, how was it in your room there?
Fantastic, if I do say so myself. I think the screenshot that I'd uploaded was the Flex Kit, this kind of tool we'd used, and so that kind of kicked off our conversation, which was really about how you deconstruct work, and that was largely based on the philosophies of John Boudreau, who's a big mentor amongst quite a few people at Dolby. But it's, how do you deconstruct work? And that's both in terms of, what makes sense in the office and doesn't, but what makes sense kind of, what to automate, what in terms of what jobs to do. Like, we've got a great hire, they want to go fully remote. How do we take pieces of their job that need to happen in person and move that to some role that is already in person or with somebody who wants to be more in person? So that was kind of where we started. And from there, it was, the urge to pick these sort of hard and fast policies sometimes to say, and I hear it at Dolby too, why can't we just pick 2 days a week and be done? Can we just say everybody in Tuesdays, Thursdays, and just end it there? And that works, to some extent, but it's such a missed opportunity to really examine exactly the work that we're doing and to design that work better and to look for those inefficiencies and to solve for them. So that was kind of the first half. And then we sort of ended on, what do you do with these challenging leaders that say, no, 5 days a week in the office every day, despite the fact, half my team's quitting on a consistent basis. And, how do you prove that that's a really silly model, both on a logic sense and a cultural sense and all of the above. So I feel like we spread the gambit. I'm sure I missed something there. I apologize to anyone in the group I forgot.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that Flex Kit screenshot. That's extremely helpful. And yes, John Boudreau, he's done some great work there, right, on breaking down the work into chunks. I think he uses the ice cube analogy on how you can use different shapes of ice cubes and they represent the work people do. I attended a talk of his once and he had that, which is very interesting. So we have about less than 5 minutes. I'm going to open this up to the rest of the folks on the call. What other questions do you have for our panelists? I know, you've only in one room, so if you have a particular question for one of the other panelists, now is the time. So go ahead and come off mute or get on camera and go ahead and ask your questions.
If you don't have a question, did you have a big aha?
That too.
Or a little aha?
I had an aha. In my organization, we are doing some stay interviews as well as some leaving interviews, and we're using the Gallup questions for the stay interviews about whether people have a friend at work, and we're getting those measures and finding out what those percentages look like. I wonder if we are bold enough to include in our interviews, our exit interviews, how much of a factor the remote work environment may be. Because I was on a call, remote call, when it was announced that we were going to be coming back into the office, and the looks on the faces were just crushing. And one young mother said, "I'm going to have to get a new wardrobe, since I've had my baby, my clothes don't fit." And I just thought, that's so real. She's just being very honest and real. And I thought, there's going to be a lot more going on than a new wardrobe for her. I mean, she will be dealing with daycare because this is her first baby. And this was something that was announced that would be happening next week. So, yeah. So I'm just thinking, that could be a huge factor. And I wonder, I don't think you should ask the question if you're not willing to address what you find when you get the answers. And so, but that's part of my role as an OD consultant, to ask those hard questions. Are we bold enough to do that?
Jeanette, I'd like to add something in there that's a little twist perhaps on what you said. In 1985, my wife and son died, and I became a single parent of 4 kids basically overnight. And that was the first time that I had, as a white male professional worker near the age of 40, that's the first time I had to personally deal with childcare and the detailed scheduling and so forth. It was a profound awakening. And I would maintain that most of us old white men, and that's what I am now, I'm not 40 anymore, don't have any idea what that delightful young mother is going through. And I found that experience that I had has made me much more empathetic and considerate, because that delightful young new mother is probably a highly trained, very well experienced professional person that can make a profound influence in the organizational thinking and decision-making process. And oh, by the way, she can also bring the female mom, young mom perspective, which may very well be part of the consumers of our product and services that we really ought to be in touch with. So your points are just so well taken. Thank you for sharing that.
I was just going to add to that. I think you make a really important point, but it's also not only about, it's not just about coming, back to work. It's about recognizing that when we start talking about how many hours we spend at work, how many hours we might work from home, we still are dealing with this old kind of adage that is like that we're all doing the same amount of work in 1 hour.
Yes.
And the reality is that that's not how it actually is. I've often argued, and I can only talk about myself, that people who hire me get a really good deal, because though they might, in traditional, pay mechanisms, they may only pay me for on an hour, for an hourly basis. But what they get out of me in an hour is very different to what they're going to get from someone else who might take 3 hours to do it. So I think we've really got to change a lot of our thinking in this new normal. Has to change, not just about whether we spend so many hours at work or so many hours. It's recognizing that what we can do, what some of us can actually do in the hours that we're actually working. And I think that that's something that's not being significantly looked at.
Well, and it also goes to the fact that, lots of conversations in the past 2 years, especially through my HR organization, is around the mental health aspect of what the pandemic has done to people that it probably may not have had we not had this colossal event happen in the world. So, the stress of how we're approaching return to work is having all kinds of, or can possibly be having some effects on people's ability to do their job because their mental state is impacted a little differently as well.
Yeah, definitely. Well-being is a big, big part of it. Let's have one last comment. I'm very cognizant of time here. So Jamie, you have your hand. Let's have you comment and then we'll wrap it up. You're more than welcome to stay, everybody, on the call. We usually keep it open for another 10-15 minutes, but we'll officially wrap it up after Jamie has an opportunity to speak.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you to Peter for being so humble and vulnerable in your share, to share such a personal story. I appreciate that so much. And I also appreciate, that what it brought up for me is, the fact that I brought this up in discussion. I'm a military spouse of an active duty military member. I have to move everywhere. I don't have the opportunity to have this grand career on a trajectory that goes up and up and up, or have a retirement or any of those kind of things. So the way of working right now is so important and so valuable to me and my family because it enables so much more opportunity and growth. I mean, before the pandemic, the military spouse unemployment rate was 24%. And that's, it's because of our inability to keep continuity. It's not because of our lack of education or experience, because we have almost too much of all that kind of stuff. So I appreciate that. And the other thing I wanted to say was that, kind of going to the comments that were just made, I feel like there is something that needs to be said about, like, none of the things that, Denise, you were talking about, none of these things are new, right? People, an hour always meant different things to different people. It always had a different value. But now it's sort of forcing the factor, just like in recent conversations I've had, it's forcing people to examine, like, where does the definition of professional come from? Where does the definition of professionalism come from? And how we interpret, what does that mean? You're not a professional unless you do X, Y, Z. You work these kind of hours. You're not a reputable professional unless you're working in your box, right? And where does that come from? I think the pandemic helped us to completely blow that up. And that's the struggle right now, is people not really, being comfortable with the fact that, it's out there for everybody to see. 1 hour is not the same for everybody. And it doesn't matter if you're working in corporate or in a nonprofit or the government, wherever. And I think that's a really good thing for us to maybe continue to drill into, especially in this community, because I think that's, it just comes down to, people not just getting occupations, but us being really intentional about what our occupations really require of humans, right? And how we need to change that. That's it.
Yes, thank you, Jamie. I mean, on this call, all the folks who are here now and who left us since for other engagements, etc., they might have, it's really up to each one of us to truly help educate the leaders and the organizations on all these challenges we've talked about, because people are so busy just trying to get the work done, they forget to think about that bigger picture and what those implications are. Janet, thank you for bringing up, should we be bold enough to include that question on a questionnaire? Should we be bold enough to go and talk to our leaders about, hey, this is a working mom, or, the hours are different for different people. Let's start becoming more human in our approach versus, so robotic and looking at people as robots. So, that's why we have organizations like ODNet, right, where we can come together and ideate, brainstorm, or learn from each other. So I want to thank our esteemed panel for your time and for your generosity in sharing all this amazing information about your organizations. Yes, if you all want to come off mute, let's just do a really good round of applause or the handshaking. Jim, I don't know if you want to do a picture here, but just to wrap this up, I know it takes a lot of commitment, and as panelists, you do need to prepare a little bit. So we really appreciate you taking the time to do that and bringing this amazing knowledge to us. Please don't feel limited to just coming and joining us for tonight's meeting. You're more than welcome to monitor all the other topics that happen throughout the year, and feel free to drop in anytime. We would love to have you here. For the rest of the folks, we will not end the discussion right here. We'll still keep the Zoom room open for at least another 10 minutes. So feel free to hang out and socialize and chit chat. Our panelists, if you need to drop off, we understand, but if you can hang out, we would love that. So thank you again.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Pallavi, and for our panelists. I mean, I was telling Pallavi during one of the breakouts that this has been an exceptional meeting because she has brought such quality perspectives to this, 3 very different perspectives who all were experts in their field and have great experiences to share. And it's, in a way, it's a shame that we always try to cut off. We try to make a hard stop at 9 and a soft stop at about 8:45 so that we can sort of wrap, because frankly, this is a real sweet spot. This last 15 minutes of a meeting, this is the time when the people bring their wisdom forth. We have all of this information that we have absorbed over the last hour to hour and a half, and then the wisdom comes forth from the crowd. And we have some very wise people in this group. So it's almost a shame to stop it once it starts flowing like this. But I know that we all have been here and have places to go. So we try to compromise by stopping, then informally staying a while, just a little longer, and then we finally have to go. So thank you again. Let's turn off the recording at this time.
Oh, and the feedback, Jim.
Yes, and I put the feedback